Welcome and thank you for stopping by Sheila's Audiobooks, and I am Sheila. This recording is coming from South Texas. All stories on this recording are in the public domain per United States copyright law. This story is about... He was big and dark. He had black eyes and a lean face. It was a hard face. I noticed the scar under his chin. I'd seen knife scars before. It was long and slightly curved, and a nasty red color. I got the idea that it wasn't a very old scar. He caught me looking at him. Mistral. It was the way he ate spaghetti that first attracted my attention. I'd put Remings on the Conti Grand, in a more or less sober condition, and the noon sailing vessel had got away from the Genoa docks. I'd been hungry, and I'd wandered along the dock section looking for a restaurant. The one I'd picked had fooled me. It smelled pretty badly and there were thousands of flies. They were persistent and buzzy and they seemed to like Italian food. But the spaghetti was good. As I wound it round my fork, I looked around the small dirty room and saw him. He was eating the stringy stuff, but he was cutting it with a knife. That seemed a bit stiff, in Genoa, and after I'd done 2 plates of it, smothered with a good Parmesan cheese, I looked him over just out of curiosity. He was big and dark. He had black eyes and a lean face, very lean for his size. It was a hard face, yet there was softness in his eyes. I caught him once when he was inspecting fly specks on the ceiling, and noticed the scar under his chin. His skin was white and the scar stood out pretty clearly. I'd seen knife scars before, and this looked like one. It was long and slightly curved, and a nasty red color. I got the idea that it wasn't a very old scar. His suit was of grey material, a quiet cloth. It fit him very well. I decided that he wasn't an Italian. He caught me looking at him, and it seemed to make him nervous. The next time I glanced in his direction, I caught him watching me without appearing to do so. His hands were nervous and the muscles of his mouth twitched. While I was drinking terrible coffee, I heard him say, "Damn flies." His voice was thick, but without accent. 2 boats had come to Genoa that day from the States, a big one and a small one. I decided that he was an American and that he'd just arrived. He paid his check and went past me as I was trying to think in terms of the lira. I smiled a little, and he started to smile. But something changed his mind. He looked worried and frowned, turning his head away from me. He was better than 6 feet tall and had very broad shoulders, but his body hunched forward when he walked. I thought about him several times as I drove toward the border town of Ventimiglia. At Street Remo I got my trunks from the rear of the car and had a swim in the Mediterranean. It was around 3 in the afternoon and the day was hot. I forgot about the scarred one until I'd driven across the border into France and had reached Monte Carlo. Before the casino I stopped to light a cigarette, and a great yellow machine pulled up. It was of Italian make, a very expensive type of car. The chauffeur was an Italian. And from the rear of the machine my scarred friend descended. He spoke to the chauffeur and didn't see me, and I turned my back as he went into the casino. I was very curious about him. That fly-filled, dock section eating place, the knifed spaghetti and this expensive machine, there was something strange in the combination. I followed him into the casino, and knew at once he had never been there before. He didn't seem to know just what to do, and the ornate reception hall that lay ahead of him didn't offer any solution. I felt that he'd expected to see the gambling tables immediately and he was confused. An attendant approached and spoke to him in French. He merely asked if he could be of service, but the scarred one did not understand. I was very close to him and I acted on impulse. At his side I smiled. "You buy an admission ticket in this room on your left," I said, and gestured toward the room with the low counters and the cashiers behind them. He stared at me with his dark eyes, and then they got very cold. The warmth went from them so suddenly that I started to turn away. But he said, "Thanks, buddy." I nodded. Well, I was sure that he was an American and that he didn't speak French and that he was afraid of something. And I was interested. But I knew that showing interest would be about the best way of learning nothing. So I sauntered into the room on my left and reached the billets de jour counter. I handed over my passport and 10 francs and received the billet, after my name and number had been jotted down. It was all done pretty rapidly, and I was turning away when I heard the scarred one say, "One admission." The Frenchman behind the counter smiled and asked for his passport. The scarred one didn't understand, so I said, still helpfully butting in, "He has to see your passport. Formality here." The dark eyes widened and his right hand went to the inside pocket of his grey coat. I caught the red color of the passport binding, but that was all. It slipped out of sight again and the scarred one swore. "Must have left it at home," he muttered in his thickish voice. That was a pretty bad one. He wasn't giving me credit for having eyes or brains. But I smiled at him. "You can still get inside," I said. "Give him your name and the name of your villa or hotel. Tell him you're very anxious to make a little play, you feel lucky. Smile at him." I expected him to say he couldn't speak French, and to ask me if I would help. And I was prepared to tell him that the man behind the counter could speak 5 languages quite well, and English was one of them. But I was fooled. The scarred one smiled at the man behind the counter. He said that he'd left his passport in his hotel and that he felt lucky and would like to try roulette. The casino employee smiled back, said that it was not good to leave one's passport behind, and asked him his name. The scarred one said, Thomas Burke." I knew that he was lying. The man back of the counter continued to smile and asked the hotel in the town where Mr. Burke resided. The scarred one said, "I stay at Cannes, at the Grand Hotel." The Grand Hotel was very safe. Practically every French and Italian Riviera town has a Grand Hotel, and I once knew a village that had 2 for a time. But it happened that the date was August the 3rd, and the Grand Hotel in Cannes had only been open 3 days. There were very few persons staying there. It did much better in the winter season. The proprietor was a friend of mine. I had been at the hotel for a time the night previous and was quite sure no Thomas Burke was staying there. The scarred one received his billet, which ticket entitled him to play roulette, but not baccarat. I went from the room ahead of him and into the large reception hall. The scarred one halted and lighted a cigarette very popular with Americans. I saw the color of the package reflected in the mirrors about the room. Then I passed into the salon and went to a table that was not too crowded. The ball fell on red numbers 4 times in succession. I went to a change booth and bought 4,000 franc oblong chips. Returning to the table, I placed one of the oblongs worth $40 on black. The ball rolled against the spin of the wheel, and finally dropped into the groove of a black number. A croupier raked another oblong chip against mine and I picked both of them up and left the table. I had won $40 in one play, and that completed my particular system for beating the casino. It was not very often that I won my $40 on the first play, but quite often I was 1 bet ahead of the casino before I lost my 4 or 5 oblongs. And whenever I was that 1 bet ahead, I quit. I never attempted to gamble my limited funds against the casino's almost unlimited ones. And I remembered being told by one of the biggest gamblers of the Riviera that if all those who played at the casino played as I did, it would be pretty tough for Monte Carlo. It was betting small money against big money, betting that the casino would go broke before they did, that made it easy for the casino. As usual, I was pleased. I cashed in my chips and looked around for the scarred one. In the large salon I failed to see him immediately. When I did see him I strolled over to the table where he had seated himself. He had $700 or $800 worth of chips before him, and he was playing 1,000 franc oblongs on the line between 2 numbers. He won once while I was watching, and his face was expressionless. The world's greatest gambling casino did not awe him now. He was gambling. And it was easy to see that he was accustomed to gambling. He won again, just before I left, but he did not smile. The payoff was 18 oblongs for his won $720. And it was his second 18 for 1 win in several minutes. Outside the casino I stood for some seconds and thought about the passport I'd seen. I decided that the scarred one was a crook and did not care to take a chance. Either the passport he had was a bad one and he didn't wish it to get in Monte Carlo records, or it was a good one and he was afraid of a leak somewhere. Or he was afraid of something that might happen in the future, and a checking up at the casino might follow. Showing a passport at the border was something else again. And there was just the barest possibility that my scarred friend was a big shot, and might have been recognized and not allowed to play. That has happened at Monte Carlo. The casino authorities are very careful about some details, and, as everyone knows, they are very careless about others. I forgot about him while driving the Grand Corniche. The day was very hot, there was not a breath of wind. At Nice I stopped at the Frigate Bar for a champagne cocktail, and at a little beach between Nice and Cannes I got damp trunks from the rear of my small car and had another swim. Then I drove on again, wondering if Remings on the way back home from Genoa were sober yet. I decided that he probably was not. It was a bit cooler when I drove round that point of land to the east of Cannes. The town lay in a semicircle, the waterfront was crescent-shaped before me. On the far side were the Mistral mountains coming down to the sea. It was a nice sight. A harsh horn from behind caused me to pull to the right of the road along the Croisette, and with a rush and another burst from its horn, a great yellow machine went past. I recognized the machine and the chauffeur, and caught a glimpse of the scarred man in the rear seat. He was grinning broadly, and I guessed that he'd won quite a bit. But why hadn't he stayed on, playing his winning streak to the limit? The Grand Hotel was along the Croisette, a distance beyond the spot where I should have turned off to my small hotel. But I didn't turn off. I drove on slowly, and a square or so from the Grand I passed the big yellow machine, moving slowly. The chauffeur was grinning. I sat in the car near the Grand and smoked a cigarette. When I went inside there was no sign of the scarred one, but my friend the proprietor was about. We went into his little office and talked about other things and then about the scarred one. Yes, he'd arrived. Traveling very light in a hired car. Just 2 bags, without many seals. His name was Anthony Senna, he was from New Orleans, in America. He had a room with bath, but not facing the Mediterranean. I raised my eyebrows and my friend smiled at me. It was not a matter of money, I think, he said. It was a matter of wind. Wind? My friend the proprietor nodded. Monsieur Senna, he does not like the wind, explained. It keeps him awake of nights, it annoys him. And when there is a mistral, as you know, there is wind. Much wind. There was certainly much wind when there was a mistral. For 3 or 6, and on rare occasions for 9 days there was the wind. It blew straight in from the Mediterranean, out of a cloudless sky. It spread sand all over the Croisette, the curving road along the beach, with the fashionable bars and shops. It ripped awnings and sent smart yachts behind the concrete seawall to the tiny harbor. It battered 10-foot waves over the sand, and the spray from them was salty on your lips, a square from the Croisette. And all the time the sky was blue. And the scarred one who had stated in Monte Carlo that his name was Thomas Burke, and in Cannes that it was Anthony Senna, did not like the wind. This one who had cold eyes when spoken to, and who cut spaghetti with a knife in a dirty, waterfront eating place in Genoa, and who played 1,000-franc chips at Monte Carlo, the wind kept him awake at night. He stays here for some little time? I asked my friend. The proprietor shrugged. On the Riviera, who can tell how long one stays? He countered. But I have given him a room on the top floor, on the corner, facing the rear. On the corner, facing the rear? I repeated, puzzled. I said that because one of the peculiar things about top-floor corner rooms at the Grand was that they had only the 2 windows at the rear. There was no side window. And there was no room next to them, but rather very large linen closets. The rooms were apt to be hot at this time, very hot. The proprietor nodded, and I said, I suppose he looked at some other rooms? My friend seemed a little surprised at my interest. But then we talked often of unimportant things, of things that seemed unimportant to us, and yet very important to others. Monsieur Senna looked at several rooms and selected the one at the east corner, the proprietor told me. Well, in event of a mistral, he will hear only a little wind there, I said. And my friend agreed. The walls are very thick, and the window screens quite tight. He will hear only a little of the mistral, he agreed. A telegram from Paris 3 took me to Street Raphael the next day. I was searching for a German by the name of Schmidt, who had stolen many marks from a small-town bank somewhere near Berlin, and who the Paris office of the agency with which I was connected had heard was in the French Riviera town. The office had heard incorrectly, though the Schmidt at Street Raphael slightly resembled the German thief. He was a good fellow, this Schmidt, and after we had stood each other a few rounds of drinks I left him and drove over the Estoril Mountains towards Cannes. It had started to blow, and when I took my machine over the highest stretch of road, with the Mediterranean almost 1,000 feet below, the car rocked from the gusts of wind. Mistral, I said. The beginning of one. And I thought about my friend with the scar on his chin and the warm eyes that got so suddenly cold. I drove pretty fast and reached Cannes around 4. The wind was increasing, awnings were being hauled in and yachts were steaming into the small harbor, behind the concrete breakwater. Sand was swirling in eddies across the Croisette. The two most patronized of the beach bars, the Miramar and the Chatham, were deserted. It was 3 hours before cocktail time. I went to my hotel and got the file that held my photographs. It was a big file in a special case, and I'd gone over 200 photos the night before. I did another 50 and then quit. In the fingers of my right hand I held the likeness of my scarred one. The scar was missing, and the big one was wearing his hair differently. But he was my man. I turned the photo over and read. Anthony, Tony, Senna. Chicago, September 1926. Jackie Marks' bodyguard until Marks was machine-gunned out, in March 1927. Murder suspect. Indicted 3 times, no convictions. Mixed up in Spencer Tracy kill. Not indicted. Dropped out of sight for year in early 1928. Turned up in Los Angeles on gambling barge in June 1930, after standing trial for murder of copper in Chicago in February 1929. Alphess murdered on barge 3 months later. Senna stood trial for murder. No conviction. Used plenty of money to get clear. No record after this. There was a description of the scarred one that did the trick. I guessed that he got heavier, was wearing his hair differently and was only using that Senna tag when he was forced to. He knew that there was the cart identite business, probably, and that the local police would have his name from the hotel. I decided that his passport was all right, but that he hadn't wanted Senna to get into Monte Carlo records. He'd played safe at the Grand, fearing the police, in event of any sort of accident, might check his passport. Well, I knew who he was. And I remembered that Alphess had been a big shot in Chicago, but had been driven out by Capone and had followed Horace Greeley's advice to go west. He'd worked the big gambling barge beyond the 3-mile limit, and then things had started to go wrong. I remembered that the barge had been blown up once, and set fire another time. And not long after that Fess had been shot to death. My scarred one had been indicted and tried. No conviction. That trial would have taken place along in September or October, I figured. About a year ago. I shoved the photo back in its proper file and smoked a couple of cigarettes. The wind was cutting up now, but I didn't mind it. The screens in my room's 3 windows rattled and something loose on a corner somewhere made a pounding noise at intervals. I thought of the room Senna had selected and smiled a little grimly. The theory I liked best was that Senna had murdered Alphess, a year ago. He'd kept out of sight for a while after his trial. Fess had been pretty big. Perhaps Senna had tried to move around a bit in the States. But it had been too tough. So he'd come across and had landed at Genoa. But he was still worried. He liked rooms with thick walls and without other rooms next to them. He liked them on the top floor. He was lonely and in a strange country, but he was afraid of strangers. In other words, Tony Senna must be a hunted man. After a little while I had a swim in a sea that was getting rough by the minute. The waves were 3 and 4 feet high and, in the manner of the Mediterranean, they pounded to shore very close to each other. When I got back to the hotel after my swim the Mistral was still picking up force. I changed into light flannels and slipped a Colt automatic into a deep hip pocket of the trousers. I couldn't quite make up my mind about what I wanted to do with Senna. That is, whether I wanted to talk with him, or try to talk with him. Just out of curiosity, for he wasn't wanted. A chasseur brought in another telegram. After he'd taken my franc tip and had gone, I read it. It was coded simply, from the Paris office. I was to forget about Schmidt for the time. A client in Paris was very anxious to locate one Anthony Senna, who it was thought had landed in Genoa the day before. There was a description of Senna in code, and it included the scar. I was to locate Senna and wire the office. That was all. Except that there were the letters V.I., which meant very important. I smoked another cigarette and smiled at the break putting Remings on the Conti Grand had got me. And I felt a little sorry for Senna. My hunch was that Senna hadn't come far enough away, or that he'd come to the wrong place. In any case, business was business. I went to the French Telegraph and sent a coded wire to Paris. It was to the effect that one Anthony Senna who answered the required description was staying at the Grand Hotel at Cannes, France. When I thought of the surprise this speed would cause, in Paris, I decided I rated a drink or two. So I drove against a rising wind and parked near the Chatham. Senna wasn't there. It was after 7 and the bar was crowded. The pajamas the women wore were as colorful as usual but had long ceased to startle me. I went outside, having trouble getting the door opened against the Mistral wind, and went inside the Miramar. At first I didn't see my man. This bar was larger and noisier and more crowded. I went toward a small table in a far, dark corner. And then I saw Tony Senna. He was slouched low in one of the big lounging chairs. His big body was slumped, his arms were at his sides. From where he sat he had a view of the whole bar and of the entrance. On the table before him was a glass of beer. His face was twisted, he looked miserable. When he caught sight of me he straightened a little. He started to smile. I waved a hand carelessly and watched the hard expression come into his eyes. But it went away, and he sort of grinned. He hesitated, then said thickly, "Alone, have a drink?" Jay hesitated. Being an agency man has its Judas moments. This was one of them. I'd sold this man out, and he was asking me to drink with him. I said, "All right, sure." I dropped into the lounge chair across the table from him, leaned forward. "My name's Ben," I said, lying because I knew he would lie. And he did. "Mine's Burke," he replied. "Tom Burke. Thanks for that tip at the casino. I was kinda worried in there, and maybe I didn't act right with you." I waved that off. A gust of the Mistral wind made things sing and rattle outside. The big one shivered. "Mistral," I said pleasantly. "Just getting into action." He swore. "Hate wind. Gets me. Mistral, eh? What in hell's that?" I ordered a whiskey sour. "Just wind," I told him. "If it's a real Mistral it'll last 3 days, or 6, or 9. The 9s are pretty rare." He sat up straight and blinked at me. "Like this, for 9 days?" he muttered. "Lord, I'd go crazy." I nodded. "Some people do," I said. "There's a sort of unwritten French law, it applies to men and women living together. If one of them murders the other along about the 8th or 9th day, it doesn't count." Senna stared at me. "No kiddin'?" he muttered. "That's what they say, pretty hard to convict in such a case. The wind gets at you after 4 or 5 days. I've never seen a 9-day affair, but I've been around for a couple of the 6-day sessions." He muttered something I didn't catch and sipped his beer. Every few seconds he'd look toward the entrance, and his dark eyes were sharp. No one came in unless he saw him. I thought of the wire I'd just sent, and felt strange about it. The agency game can give you lousy moments. When the waiter came with my whiskey sour I lifted it slowly and said cheerfully, "Here's to crime." He grinned at that and raised his beer glass. I frowned at it. "Beer's no good here," I told him. "It's a waste of time." And he said a little grimly, without thinking too much, "Yeah, but it doesn't hurt my eyes or nerves any." There was something about the scarred one that I liked. I didn't bother figuring just what it was. Perhaps I felt a little sorry for him. I had a very strong hunch that death was coming his way. His actions didn't hurt my hunch any. He wasn't exactly scared, but he was nervous. I wanted to know something, so I went after it. "You haven't been over here long, have you?" I asked, and didn't make my voice too anxious. He looked at me narrowly. "I'm an engineer," he said. "I've been down in Mexico, alone a lot. Had a couple of months leave due me, and grabbed a freighter for Genoa. Just an idea." I nodded. I didn't believe that he was an engineer, but I did believe that he'd been in Mexico and that he'd been there alone. He was fed up, and he'd picked the Riviera and Cannes. And it hadn't worked. And he was drinking with the man who had spotted him, turned his name up. There was a crash of glass, somewhere beyond the bar. The entrance door opened and a group of people came in, laughing and letting the wind carry them along. Senna hunched down in the chair again. "I hate wind," he muttered. "I gotta get out of this town." I thought of my wire and didn't like that idea. So I said, "It'll be blowing all along the Riviera. And you'd have to go pretty far back in the mountains to dodge this breeze. You can't be sure, it may not stick. Tomorrow morning you may not feel a breath of wind." That was an ironic thought. A fast plane could reach Cannes from Paris in 5 hours. The regular planes did it in 6. If someone wanted to see Senna badly enough, if I wasn't going haywire on my basis and hunches, someone could be at the Grand Hotel around midnight. A good plane could edge into the wind and get down all right. Senna said, "You think it may let up, eh? I nodded, and finished my whiskey sour. Sure, I said. Have one on me? He had another beer, and I had another sour. I tried to get him to open up a little, but he didn't want to talk. He kept his eyes on the entrance door and on human faces that passed near our corner. I said, "You played at the casino, any luck?" He grinned, showing white teeth. Then his dark eyes got hard and frowning. "Yeah, too much, maybe," he stated. I looked puzzled. "Too much?" I said. He got sort of a silly smile on his face, only it wasn't all the way silly. After a few seconds of silence he said a little grimly, "I've only been this lucky a few times in my life. And right after those times, I got unlucky. You know how it is." I finished my second sour and rose. "Yes, sure," I said. "I know how it is. See you again." He didn't seem surprised at the abruptness of my departure. "Yeah," he said. "So long." I went out into the wind, got to a phone in the Miramar Hotel and called the office of the small flying field at the end of town. I was known there as J. Ben, and sometimes I used a ship for a fast hop to Germany or Switzerland or Spain. In Cannes I was thought to be a pretty good American, with enough money but not too much. A fellow who liked that section of the coast. I got Leon Demoyne on the phone and asked him to ring me if a plane landed around midnight. He said that he would if I wanted him to, but that he could tell me now that one was coming down from Paris. She was a fast monoplane, and there would be 2 passengers aboard, beside her pilot. I told him that was not the plane I was thinking about, and he said he'd advised by wire against the flight, but that the ship was apparently coming along anyway. He ended up by saying that it was probably bringing along a couple of crazy Americans who had heavy dates. Even in French his idea didn't sound right to me. I thought it was perfectly right that the plane was bringing along a couple of Americans. But I was quite certain they weren't coming because of the kind of heavy dates Leon anticipated. And I was damned sure they weren't crazy. I had dinner alone at a small Russian restaurant, and the black bread didn't taste as good as usual. The thing that got me was that I was pretty sure Tony Senna wasn't wanted by the police. I was pretty sure that crooks were using a reputable agency, as they had used agencies before, to trace another crook. I had the feeling that I'd put Senna on the spot, and I didn't like it. He was a killer and probably a lot of things that went with it, but it seemed to me he wasn't going to have much of a chance. I could almost hear guns, and I could almost see the big scarred man going down. I might be all wrong, but the setup framed things that way. At 10 o'clock I went back to the hotel and found the telegram I expected. It was from McKee, the agency head, and it was brief. I read, "Fine fast work clients, please drop further investigation of Senna." It was in code. And it convinced me that death was coming close to the big fellow. I was to drop out, which was not the ordinary method. The clients would handle things themselves. And they were pleased. I lay on my bed and listened to the Mistral wind howl. It was getting on my nerves too. After a half hour or so I made a decision. Business was business, but some of it took away too much self-respect. I drove to the Grand Hotel. Senna was not in. When I got to the Miramar bar he was just where I'd left him. He'd been eating sandwiches, and he was still drinking beer. He grinned at me. "I couldn't go out in that stuff," he said. "So I just stuck here." I nodded and pulled a chair close to him. I ordered coffee and Finn. He was looking at me with his dark eyes narrowed. "Damn Mistral," he muttered. "You think it'll last 3 days, maybe 6?" I said. "You never can tell." Then I went right into it. "Listen, Senna," I said softly and without paying any attention to his start of surprise, "you got a tough break in Genoa. I happened to eat in the same spot and see you. I saw your passport edge, at the casino in Monte Carlo, and I know some things. My name isn't Ben, and I'm connected with an international detective agency. My office wired me to look for you, and I wired back that you were at the Grand Hotel here. 2 Americans are coming down by plane, clients of the Paris office of my agency. They're coming down to see you, and they'll get here about midnight. It took me a little while to figure things out, and when I got them figured out I decided that you were being spotted out for killing Alphas on his gambling barge, off Santa Monica. I didn't like my part, so I'm warning you. That's all of it." His big hands were gripping the table edge, and getting white with that grip. His dark eyes were slitted and cold. I kept my right hand on the Colt grip. "I don't think you're the whitest guy that ever lived," Senna, I said. And I've got my hand on a rod now. So don't do the wrong thing. What I want to get across is that my hunch is the law isn't coming after you. Not my kind of law. You've got a couple of hours, and you don't like wind. I'm all right, because I wired you were staying at the Grand, and you were? You can hire a machine. I stopped. Senna had taken his whitened knuckles away from the table. He was relaxed in the big chair, and his face held a terrible grin. He chuckled. I stared at him and he shook his head slowly. Lord. He breathed. Imagine a dick tipping me off. Imagine that. I smiled a little. But I didn't say anything. He kept on shaking his head. After a while he lighted a cigarette. I wouldn't waste too much time, Senna, I told him. This wind may not hold up that plane too much. He shook his big head. I ain't going away, Ben, or whatever your name is, he said slowly, tonelessly. I've been leaving places for a long time now. Going places, far places. Spots I didn't like, see? They've been after me a long time. I ain't saying I did for Fess, but if ever a guy rated a dose of lead, that rat did, see? But me, I'm staying here. Don't be a fool, Senna, I said. The law doesn't want you. He looked suddenly tired. These guys are worse than the law, Ben, he said wearily. I tell you, I'm tired of running away. I'm staying here. Now you, he raised a big forefinger and pointed it at me, get the hell out of here. I said as I rose slowly. Well, I warned you. I may be all wrong, but I tipped you, Senna. There was irony in his eyes. Sure, Ben, he said. Now you get the hell away from me. The plane landed at 12:10 by my wristwatch. It landed in a nasty wind, after circling the lighted field 3 times. She was a small monoplane, cabin type. I had my car on the Fréjus road, with the lights out. After about 10 minutes a car that had been waiting at the field turned into the main road and moved toward Cannes. I had to drive very fast to follow it. I was several squares behind when it reached the Grand Hotel. The wind was raising the devil with the palms along the Croisette. It seemed to be steadily increasing. I parked a square away and went into the hotel by a side entrance. When I reached the main lobby no one was about but the concierge. He knew me. He said that the 2 gentlemen had said they didn't want Monsieur Senna disturbed, but was he in his room? And he said that he had told them that Monsieur Senna was at the Blue Frog. And they had thanked him and departed. They had not engaged rooms and they had not brought any baggage into the hotel. How do you know Monsieur Senna is at the Blue Frog? I asked. The concierge shrugged. He has told me that he thought he would go there, he returned. He has asked me for a quiet place to drink, where there is music and yet not a crowd. And where the lights would not hurt his eyes. C'est ça, I muttered grimly. Well, it was so. The Blue Frog was a small drinking and dancing place. There was a 2-piece orchestra and the lights were dim. It was not smart and it didn't get much of a crowd. I reflected that dim lights would give Senna a better chance, and that a small crowd would mean less chance of humans other than those concerned being hit by stray bullets. I wasn't sure that Senna cared much about other humans, but every man has his particular code of what he calls honor. Senna was no exception. The Blue Frog was just off the Rue d'Antibes, the main business street of Cannes, at the east end of town. It was set back in some palms and there were no buildings very close to it. In my car I drove fast, parked a half square away and hurried on. I went in a side entrance and spotted Senna right away. His eyes were narrowed on mine and he was smiling. He wasn't slumped in any lounging chair this time. He sat on a small wooden chair. It had no arms. Both hands were in the pockets of his light suit coat, and he was seated slightly to the left of the table. He faced the side entrance directly, and the main entrance to the place was in a line with his big body. I stood for several seconds looking at him. Then I went to the bar. I ordered scotch, straight. The 2-piece orchestra was playing AEE with the guitar dominating the piano. There were only a few people inside. Mistrals kept folk at home. And that was good, too. When I lifted my drink, my fingers were shaking a little. There was a mirror beyond the bar, and I looked into it. I could see the front entrance. The barman saw my shaking fingers and guessed wrong. He said that the Mistral was not good, it did bad things with one's nerves. I agreed and downed the scotch. As I set the glass on the counter my eyes went to the mirror, and I saw a tall, hard-faced man come in. I turned and looked toward the side entrance. A shorter, heavier man stepped inside the dimly lighted room, letting a rush of wind in with him. A girl laughed shrilly, and the orchestra continued its swift rhythm. I think they both saw Senna at the same instant. With so few people in the place, that wasn't hard. I saw the shorter one of the two stiffen, and his coat material came up from the bottom. There were two terrific crashes. No Maxim silenced guns, these. There were screams. The short one took one step forward and crashed to the floor. I swung around and stared at Senna. There was another gun crash and his big body jerked. But his right hand came up. His left battered the table aside and he walked toward the main entrance and toward the tall, hard-faced man. There was another gun crash and Senna's left arm hung limp at his side. His gun was up, extended in his right hand. He kept walking, his face twisted in a terrible smile. The tall one was staring at him. He fired again, but the bullet went wild. It tore artificial flowers from a wall behind Senna. And then Senna worked his gun. It crashed again and again. I counted 4 shots, and then all sound was merged into a terrible roar. When the roar died away, I went toward the two motionless figures on the floor near the door. The tall one was dead. Senna was alive, he said weakly, as I leaned over him. The others, done? I left him and went to the side entrance door. The thick-set one was dead, too. The bullet had ripped upward through his mouth. I went back and kneeled beside Senna. Both done, I told him. He tried to grin, but it was too tough. He said, very weakly, "Sure, I got, I'll fess." And a few seconds later he said, "Guy, I can't hear, that damn wind." "Take it easy, Senna." I couldn't think of anything else to say. He closed his eyes and after a few seconds more he said weakly, "Funny, if it hadn't been for that damn wind, I might have run again. But it just made me sore, made me want to stick here." He didn't say any more. He was dead when a very excited gendarme reached my side and asked a dozen questions one after another. I answered one of them and went to the bar for another drink. It was some time before I got it. As I sipped it I decided that it was just as well Senna had had a funny idea about the wind, if he had had it. You can't always be running away from things. The Mistral lasted 3 days, and when it was over the sun was very hot. The Blue Frog did a big business. The proprietor put a frame around a hole made by one of the bullets that missed Senna. The smart crowd went in for a look, and the French townspeople went in too. The proprietor told me he would have liked to frame one of Tony Senna's bullets, but that couldn't be done. Senna hadn't missed. Thank you for listening to today's episode. I really hoped you enjoyed it. There will be more to come. Please subscribe not to miss out on what is next. I will be looking forward to your return. The music is by Madfan from Pixabay. To support this and other artists go to pixabay.com. Sheila.